Rick Sanchez is known for bending reality, collapsing timelines, and treating the universe like a poorly designed toy. But none of that is what makes him strange on a daily basis. What stands out most, once the portals close and the danger fades, are the habits. The small, unremarkable routines that persist no matter how much of existence he has already dismantled. For someone capable of rewriting physics, Rick is deeply committed to doing things the same way every day. He wakes up at irregular hours, but follows oddly specific rituals once he does. He moves through the house like someone who has memorized it too well, never hesitating, never correcting course. His movements suggest a familiarity that borders on boredom. Not boredom with the house itself, but with the idea that it could ever surprise him. Rick drinks constantly, but not randomly. There is a rhythm to it. Certain moments demand it. Others do not. He reaches for a flask the way someone else might reach for a watch, less out of need than habit. It is part of how he marks time, even if he would never admit that time still matters to him. He leaves things unfinished everywhere. Tools scattered across the garage, half-built devices abandoned without explanation. But this mess is not careless. It is curated. Rick knows exactly where everything is, even when it looks like chaos. The disorder is familiar to him, comfortable. Cleaning would imply closure, and Rick rarely allows things to feel complete. He also talks to himself constantly, but not in moments of crisis. He does it during mundane tasks, adjusting equipment, walking through rooms, waiting for something to finish. These comments are rarely useful. They serve no instructional purpose. They are more like background noise, filling the silence before it has a chance to settle. Rick has a strange relationship with food. He eats without ceremony, without pleasure, but with consistency. Certain foods reappear over and over, not because he enjoys them, but because they are predictable. He does not experiment with meals the way he experiments with universes. Eating is a task to be completed efficiently, not explored. And yet, he is oddly particular. He notices when something tastes different. He reacts when routines are interrupted. The smallest inconvenience will irritate him more than cosmic danger ever could. It is as if the ordinary still has the power to annoy him in ways the extraordinary lost long ago. Rick also waits in strange ways. He never looks idle, but he spends a lot of time doing nothing while pretending not to, leaning against surfaces, sitting in silence, staring at nothing in particular. These pauses are brief but frequent. They suggest a mind that has nowhere new to go, only places it revisits endlessly. He avoids explaining himself whenever possible, not just about science or morality, but about everyday decisions. Why he does things a certain way. Why he insists on routines that serve no obvious purpose. Explanation would imply intention, and intention would invite scrutiny. Rick prefers to let his habits exist without justification. One of the strangest things about Rick is how attached he is to outdated technology, old screens, old interfaces, devices that could be replaced instantly. He keeps them not because they are better, but because they are familiar. They work the way he expects them to. They do not surprise him. Rick hates surprises in the ordinary world. He tolerates them only in the cosmic one. He repeats insults he no longer finds funny, uses the same dismissive gestures, reacts to situations before they fully unfold. These behaviors are automatic now, worn smooth by repetition. They function like muscle memory, saving him the effort of genuine engagement. Even his sarcasm is habitual. It appears on schedule. Certain situations trigger it reliably, like a reflex. It is less about humor and more about maintaining distance, a familiar barrier that keeps things from getting too close. Rick rarely sits comfortably. He perches, he leans, he slouches. His body never fully relaxes, even in safe spaces. It is as if stillness feels unnatural to him, something he must avoid by staying slightly in motion at all times. And yet, for all his unpredictability, Rick is remarkably consistent. He returns to the same spaces, the same arguments, the same behaviors. No matter how many universes he passes through, his daily habits remain intact. They are the constants in a life defined by infinite variation. These habits do not make Rick more relatable. They make him more human in a very specific way. They reveal that even someone who understands everything still clings to routine, still relies on repetition, still needs the comfort of predictability. Rick would never call these habits comforting. He would mock the idea, but they persist anyway, quietly anchoring him to a version of reality he claims not to care about. In the end, Rick's weirdest, everyday habits are not strange because they are chaotic. They are strange because they are ordinary, because they continue unchanged in a man who insists that nothing matters. And perhaps that is the strangest habit of all. Despite all this, Rick never acknowledges his habits as habits. He treats them as accidents of convenience, as if they happened by chance and simply never stopped. But the repetition is too consistent for that. There is intention buried somewhere beneath the indifference, even if Rick refuses to look directly at it. He always returns to the garage first. Not the living room, not anywhere meant for rest. The garage functions as his personal boundary between chaos and domesticity. It is where he transitions, where he sheds one scale of reality before stepping into another. No matter how long he has been gone, that routine holds. Rick also has a habit of checking things that do not need checking, readouts that never change, systems he already knows are stable. He glances at them anyway, as if confirming that some corner of existence still behaves exactly as expected. These checks are quick, almost unconscious, but frequent. He hoards junk that no one else would keep, broken parts, obsolete devices, things that no longer serve a purpose. He never explains why, but he also never throws them away. It is as if discarding them would imply finality, and Rick avoids finality whenever possible. Even his interruptions follow patterns. He interrupts at predictable moments, during explanations, during emotional conversations, during silence that lingers too long. The timing is consistent enough to suggest discomfort rather than impatience. Silence, especially ordinary silence, seems to bother him more than noise. Rick has a peculiar way of moving through shared spaces. He does not knock. He does not announce himself. He simply appears, as if assuming the space already belongs to him. This behavior is not aggressive. It is habitual. It reflects a worldview where boundaries are suggestions rather than rules. He also has strong opinions about trivial things: lighting, temperature, seating, the placement of objects. These preferences are rarely articulated, but they are enforced through behavior. He adjusts environments without comment, reshaping them to fit an internal standard no one else can see. Rick drinks at moments that do not correlate with stress or celebration. He drinks while waiting, while thinking, while doing nothing at all. the act itself seems less important than the continuity of it. A behavior that bridges one moment to the next, making time feel less fragmented. He frequently abandons conversations halfway through, not because he is done speaking, but because the exchange has reached a familiar point. Once a conversation becomes predictable, Rick loses interest. Novelty matters to him, even in irritation. Yet, ironically, he repeats himself constantly. The same complaints, the same insults, the same dismissals. These repetitions suggest that novelty is something he seeks outwardly, not inwardly. His internal world appears remarkably static for someone who claims to despise stagnation. Rick also fixes things that do not matter, not broken machines or failing systems, but minor inconveniences, loose components, cosmetic flaws, things no one else noticed. These fixes are quiet and uncelebrated. He does them without drawing attention, as if correcting something slightly wrong brings momentary satisfaction. He rarely finishes these fixes properly. He stops when the problem is good enough, not perfect. This incomplete resolution mirrors much of his life. Problems are addressed just enough to move on, never enough to close them fully. Rick's sleep habits are another contradiction. He sleeps irregularly, but when he does, it is often in the same places, same positions, same environments. Even rest, when he allows it, follows familiar contours. He avoids mirrors unless necessary. When he does look at himself, it is brief and functional, checking damage, assessing condition, never lingering, never reflecting. The habit suggests avoidance rather than vanity. For someone who insists that nothing matters, Rick is deeply invested in consistency. His habits create a predictable internal landscape in a universe that offers none. They are not comforts he would admit to, but they function as such regardless. These everyday behaviors do not soften Rick. They do not redeem him. They simply reveal that even the most detached mind still organizes itself around repetition, around the familiar, around patterns that make existence manageable. Rick would scoff at the idea that he needs routines. He would call them coincidences, side effects, irrelevant details, but they persist. And in a life defined by infinite choice, persistence is rarely accidental. Over time, these habits accumulate into something that resembles a structure, even if Rick would never use that word. His days are not planned, but they are patterned. He does not schedule his behavior, yet it unfolds in recognizable loops. To anyone watching closely, there is a rhythm beneath the chaos. Rick rarely acknowledges mornings as mornings. Time of day seems irrelevant to him, and yet certain actions cluster together consistently. Checking equipment, adjusting something that does not strictly need adjustment, drinking before doing anything else, as if aligning himself with a familiar baseline before engaging with the world. These sequences repeat with quiet reliability. He has an odd tendency to test things unnecessarily. Buttons get pressed more than once. Levers get pulled twice, not out of doubt, but habit. The act itself seems to reassure him that systems still respond the way they always have, that cause and effect remain intact, at least in this small corner of reality. Rick also reuses phrases long after they have lost their sharpness. Remarks that once cut now land softly, dulled by repetition. He says them anyway. Familiar language becomes another routine, another shortcut that saves him the effort of inventing something new. He shows a similar pattern with music. He gravitates toward the same sounds, the same eras, the same moods. Even with access to infinite variations, he circles back to what he already knows. Music, for Rick, is less about discovery and more about maintaining a specific internal atmosphere. He also has a habit of arriving too early or too late, rarely on time. Timing feels optional to him. What matters is arrival itself, not synchronization. This disregard for schedules is not chaotic, it is consistent. He always moves according to his own internal clock, even when it clashes with everyone else's. Rick avoids comfort in obvious ways, yet engineers it indirectly. He rejects anything that looks like rest or care, but builds environments that allow him to function without friction. Chairs positioned exactly where he wants them. Tools placed within immediate reach. He minimizes effort while pretending effort does not matter. He has a strange habit of fixing problems only when they inconvenience him personally. Large-scale disasters barely register, but a malfunctioning device that disrupts his workflow will be addressed immediately. Scale matters less than irritation. The smaller the problem, the more likely it is to bother him. Rick also repeats avoidance as a habit, avoiding certain topics, certain emotional spaces, certain reflections. When conversations drift too close to something personal, he diverts automatically, not consciously, reflexively, like stepping around a familiar obstacle without looking down. Even his departures are habitual. He leaves rooms mid-sentence, mid-thought, mid-action. The pattern is so consistent that it feels intentional, as if staying too long in one place creates a kind of pressure he refuses to tolerate. Despite all this, Rick is rarely surprised by himself. His habits keep him predictable to his own mind, even if he appears erratic to others. They provide continuity, a sense that something about him remains unchanged, no matter how much everything else shifts. These behaviors do not make Rick simpler. They make him legible, at least in fragments. They show that beneath the intellect and detachment is someone who still relies on repetition to orient himself. Someone who still needs the familiar to keep moving forward. Rick would never describe his habits as grounding. He would never admit they serve a purpose beyond convenience. But convenience, repeated often enough, becomes necessity. And in a universe where nothing stays the same for long, necessity has a way of revealing what someone truly depends on. Rick's weirdest everyday habits are not evidence of chaos, they are evidence of survival, of a mind that has seen too much choosing again and again to return to what feels known, even when he pretends it doesn't matter. As these patterns persist, they begin to reveal something Rick would never willingly acknowledge. His habits are not random remnants of convenience. They are boundaries. Quiet lines he has drawn around himself to prevent the world from demanding more than he is willing to give. Rick treats boundaries the same way he treats rules. He pretends they do not exist while relying on them constantly. He rarely commits to endings. Projects stall. Conversations trail off. Situations remain unresolved. This is not always negligence. It is a habit of avoiding closure. Closure implies finality, and finality suggests loss. Rick prefers states that can be revisited, resumed, or abandoned without consequence. His habits keep things open-ended, perpetually unfinished. He also repeats departure rituals without ceremony, grabbing the same items, standing in the same places, leaving through familiar routes. Even when disappearing into impossible destinations, his exits follow patterns. The extraordinary is accessed through ordinary motions. Rick has a habit of deflecting attention away from moments that might slow him down emotionally. When things get too quiet, too still, he introduces disruption. A comment, a movement, a task. Stillness threatens reflection, and reflection threatens discomfort. Habit provides a reliable escape. Yet, paradoxically, he also manufactures stillness for himself in controlled ways. Sitting alone in the garage, pausing between tasks, waiting without explanation. These moments are brief and carefully contained, but they recur often enough to matter. Rick allows himself quiet only when he can dictate its duration. Control is one of his most consistent habits. He controls environments through clutter that only he understands. He controls conversations by steering them away from depth. He controls time by ignoring its conventional markers. These behaviors repeat not because they are efficient, but because they reinforce his sense of autonomy. Rick does not like being needed, but he dislikes being irrelevant even more. His habits strike a balance between the two. They keep him present without requiring vulnerability, engaged without being exposed. Even his unpredictability becomes predictable. The timing of his outbursts, the moments when he disengages, the way he undercuts sincerity before it settles. These reactions arrive with such consistency that they resemble rehearsed responses. Rick has perfected the art of repetition, disguised as spontaneity. He returns to the same internal posture again and again, detached, dismissive, in control. Maintaining that posture requires maintenance, and habits provide it. They reduce the effort required to stay himself. They allow him to move through existence without renegotiating who he is at every moment. This efficiency is not laziness. It is preservation. Rick's habits also act as filters. They determine what reaches him and what does not. Certain irritations break through. Certain dangers do not. His daily behaviors decide which parts of reality he allows to matter. This selective engagement keeps him functional in a universe that would otherwise overwhelm even his capacity. He would never admit this. Admitting it would imply vulnerability. Instead, he leans harder into routine while pretending routine does not exist. These habits do not soften Rick's edges. They sharpen them. They reinforce the version of himself he relies on to keep going. A version that avoids introspection. A version that stays mobile. A version that treats familiarity as a tool rather than a comfort. But tools reveal what they are used for. Rick's everyday habits reveal that beneath the intellect, beneath the cynicism, beneath the cosmic indifference, there is a man who still needs structure, still needs repetition, still needs the reassurance of things behaving exactly as expected, not because he lacks imagination, but because he has too much of it. And so Rick continues checking the same systems, saying the same things, returning to the same spaces, performing the same gestures, not because he believes they matter, but because they make existence manageable. In a universe without anchors, even someone like Rick creates his own, quietly, relentlessly, habit by habit. Even with all of this, Rick would insist that his habits mean nothing. He would frame them as byproducts of intelligence, side effects of efficiency, quirks too minor to analyze. But habits do not need meaning assigned to them in order to function. They exist because they work. Rick's habits work. They allow him to move through days without friction, without reconsideration, without slowing down long enough for doubt to catch up. Each repeated action removes a decision from his path, and fewer decisions mean fewer moments where he has to confront why he is doing anything at all. He has a habit of positioning himself slightly apart from everyone else, not fully removed, not fully present, standing in doorways, leaning against walls, sitting where he can leave easily. These positions are chosen automatically, but they reveal a constant readiness to disengage. Rick never settles in completely. Habit keeps him mobile. He also has a way of treating objects with more consistency than people. Machines behave predictably. Tools respond the same way every time. His interactions with them follow fixed patterns. People, by contrast, introduce variables, emotional responses, expectations. Habits help Rick minimize those variables by limiting how deeply he engages. Even his sarcasm follows structure. Certain situations trigger specific responses. It is less a reaction than a script. The repetition allows him to stay ahead of emotional escalation. He deflects before things can deepen. Habit becomes armor. Rick's drinking, too, follows invisible rules. It is not chaos. It is timing. Certain phases of thought. Certain transitions between tasks. Certain pauses where nothing else is happening. The act fills gaps. It bridges moments that might otherwise invite reflection. He rarely sits with empty time unless it is on his terms. Rick also avoids beginnings as much as endings. He drops into situations midstream, skips introductions, ignores context. Habit allows him to bypass the awkwardness of starting something new. Familiarity feels safer than novelty when novelty has already been exhausted on a cosmic scale. Ironically, this makes his life smaller, not larger. Infinite universes exist, but Rick's daily world remains narrow. Same rooms, same tools, same patterns. The contrast is stark, even if he never acknowledges it. His habits compress existence into something manageable. Rick also has a habit of undercutting significance the moment it appears. A meaningful pause, a sincere observation, a moment of quiet connection. Habitual dismissal arrives quickly, smoothing over anything that might linger. This keeps emotional stakes low and predictable. Predictability matters to Rick more than he lets on. He claims to thrive in chaos, but his daily behaviors suggest otherwise. True chaos leaves no room for control. His habits restore that control in subtle ways. They turn unpredictability into background noise. Rick's weirdest everyday habits are not strange because they are random. They are strange because they are deliberate without being conscious. They operate below intention, shaping his life without requiring him to admit he needs shaping. They allow him to survive himself. In the end, Rick's habits do not contradict his intelligence. They support it. They are the infrastructure beneath the genius, the quiet framework that keeps everything from collapsing inward. He may mock routine. He may reject sentimentality. He may insist that nothing matters. But every day, he repeats the same actions, and repetition, whether acknowledged or not, is a form of care. Taken together, Rick's habits form a kind of unspoken autobiography, not a story told in words, but one written through repetition. Every repeated motion, every familiar avoidance, every ritual disguised as indifference reveals something he will never say out loud. Rick does not reflect on who he is. He reenacts it. His days loop because looping is safer than progression. Progress implies direction, and direction implies destination. Rick distrusts destinations. He has seen too many of them end badly, collapse unexpectedly, or lose their meaning once reached. Habits keep him in motion without requiring arrival. He lives in cycles because cycles do not demand hope. Rick also has a habit of minimizing transitions. He moves abruptly from one state to another without pause, from danger to domestic space, from chaos to boredom, from intensity to silence. These sharp transitions prevent emotional carryover. Habit allows him to reset without processing. Processing would slow him down. He repeats behaviors that require no emotional calibration. Tasks that feel the same no matter what happened before. This sameness creates emotional neutrality. It flattens experience just enough to keep it from overwhelming him. Rick avoids ceremony in all its forms. No preparation, no reflection, no closure. Habit replaces ritual, because ritual acknowledges meaning. Habit denies it while benefiting from its structure. Even his irritation follows predictable lines. He is annoyed by the same things repeatedly, the same incompetence, the same interruptions, the same expectations. This consistency suggests that irritation itself has become familiar, almost comforting. It is an emotion he understands well enough to tolerate. Unknown emotions are riskier. Rick also repeats moments of solitude. He disappears into the garage not just to work, but to isolate. These disappearances happen without explanation or warning, as if isolation is something he slips into automatically when engagement reaches a certain threshold. Solitude for Rick is not loneliness, it is regulation. His habits regulate exposure to people, to feeling, to reflection. They decide when he is accessible and when he is not. In this way, habits become a substitute for boundaries he refuses to acknowledge. Rick does not believe in boundaries, but he lives by them. He also repeats his disengagement from consequence. He treats fallout as temporary, repairable, dismissible. Habit supports this worldview by making everything feel reversible. If nothing is ever finished, nothing is ever fully lost. This belief allows him to keep moving. Rick's habits are not comforting in the traditional sense. They do not soothe him. They stabilize him. They keep his internal world from fracturing under the weight of what he knows. They provide a narrow path through infinite possibility. That path is repetitive, predictable, safe. And safety, though Rick would never admit it, is something he values deeply. Not safety from danger, but safety from meaning, from attachment, from vulnerability. Habits keep those things at bay. In the end, Rick's weirdest everyday habits are not evidence of stagnation. They are evidence of endurance, of a man who has outlived wonder, outpaced novelty, and survived the collapse of certainty. He repeats himself because repetition works, because it keeps him functional, because it keeps him distant, because it keeps him alive. And in a universe that offers infinite ways to fall apart, that quiet persistence may be Rick Sanchez's most human habit of all. At a certain point, Rick's habits stop looking like quirks and start looking like a language, a way of communicating without ever having to explain. If you pay attention long enough, the repetition says everything he refuses to articulate. He repeats what he understands. He avoids what he does not want to feel. Rick's habits are built around familiarity because familiarity is controllable. The unknown may excite him intellectually, but it exhausts him emotionally. After a lifetime of endless variables, sameness becomes a relief. Not a comfort he enjoys, but one he tolerates because it keeps him steady. He rarely pauses long enough to notice this himself. Rick's daily routines function like shortcuts through existence. They remove friction. They remove questions. They remove opportunities for doubt. Each habit trims away another moment where he might have to stop and consider the weight of his own choices. He prefers momentum without reflection. This is why his habits persist even when they make no sense to anyone else. They are optimized for him, for the version of Rick that must keep moving to remain intact. The version that cannot afford to linger too long in one emotional space. Even his boredom follows a pattern. He grows restless at predictable intervals. The restlessness pushes him toward action, distraction, or departure. Habit ensures he never sits with that boredom long enough for it to become introspection. Rick does not fear boredom. He fears what boredom makes room for. He also has a habit of treating days as interchangeable. One bleeds into the next with little distinction. This flattening of time reduces emotional contrast. High points never rise too high. Low points never sink too deep. Everything exists in a manageable middle ground. This is not apathy. It is regulation. Rick's habits also allow him to avoid mourning. Loss, when treated as temporary or abstract, becomes easier to outrun. By repeating the same behaviors, he convinces himself that nothing has truly changed, that the past can be folded into routine and rendered harmless. Routine becomes denial with structure. And yet there is something almost tender in the way Rick clings to his patterns. Not sentimental, not gentle, but persistent. He returns to the same gestures the way someone returns to familiar ground after a long fall, without celebration, without acknowledgement. Just relief. He does not build new habits easily. When one forms, it stays. It survives universe changes, family shifts, disasters, resets. That longevity suggests attachment, even if Rick would reject the word. His habits are the closest thing he has to permanence. They are also the closest thing he allows himself to have. Rick's weirdest everyday habits are not strange because they are odd. They are strange because they endure. In a man who treats everything as disposable, repetition becomes a contradiction he never resolves. He mocks meaning while reenacting it daily. He denies attachment while practicing it unconsciously. He claims nothing matters while behaving as though some things must remain the same. In the end, Rick's habits do not make him predictable. They make him survivable to himself. They keep him oriented when everything else spins too fast. They hold him together in ways intelligence alone never could. Rick Sanchez does not believe in stability, but every day, through habit after habit, he recreates it anyway, quietly, reluctantly, and without ever admitting that he needs it. Even now, Rick never stops to examine these patterns as a whole. He experiences them only moment to moment, action to action. Reflection would require distance, and distance would require stillness of a kind he does not willingly allow. His habits work precisely because they operate beneath awareness. They protect him without asking permission. Rick's days are stitched together by repetition, not memory. He does not look back often. He does not dwell. Habit replaces reflection by keeping him oriented forward, even when forward has no clear direction. As long as he is doing something familiar, he does not have to ask where he is going. He also uses habit to regulate attachment. He never lets any single routine become too sacred. Nothing is acknowledged as important. Everything remains technically replaceable. This gives him deniability. If pressed, he can claim that none of it matters, that it is all arbitrary. But arbitrariness repeated long enough becomes structure. Rick's refusal to name his habits does not make them weaker. It makes them more durable. Unnamed needs are harder to challenge. Unacknowledged comforts are easier to keep. His habits persist because they are never interrogated. They simply continue. He often sabotages moments that threaten to disrupt his routines. Emotional shifts, changes in environment, new expectations. When something threatens to alter his internal equilibrium, he responds quickly and dismissively. Habit acts as a corrective force, restoring familiar conditions before change can settle. This makes Rick appear volatile, but it is the opposite. He is highly invested in maintaining internal consistency. His outbursts often occur not because things are chaotic, but because they are about to become unfamiliar. Familiarity is his true constant. Rick's habits also allow him to avoid grief in its purest form. Grief requires pause. It requires acknowledgement. It requires sitting with absence. Habit replaces absence with continuity. If the routine continues, the nothing is truly gone. This is not healing, it is survival. He does not mourn so much as he moves on in a straight line, dragging the familiar behind him like an anchor. The anchor slows him just enough to keep him from drifting completely. Rick has outlived too much to believe in emotional resolution. His habits offer something else instead: endurance without transformation, the ability to keep existing without needing to change. And for Rick, that is enough. The irony is that these habits, so carefully constructed to avoid vulnerability, reveal vulnerability anyway. They show where he needs consistency, where unpredictability overwhelms him, where the universe, for all its infinite variety, has become exhausting. Rick would never describe himself as tired, but tiredness shapes everything he does. His habits are not attempts to fix the universe or improve his life. They are attempts to make existence tolerable at a scale he can manage. They compress infinity into something repeatable, something survivable. And that compression is what keeps him functioning. Rick Sanchez does not slow down because slowing down would force him to feel the full weight of everything he has seen and lost. Habit lets him keep moving without escalating, without collapsing, without stopping. In that way, his weirdest everyday habits are not flaws or quirks. They are adaptations, evidence of a mind that has reached the edge of possibility and chosen repetition over dissolution. He keeps doing the same things because the same things still hold, because routine still works when belief fails, because repetition still functions when meaning collapses, because habit, in the end, asks less of him than hope ever could. And so Rick continues, not because he believes in tomorrow, not because he expects things to improve, but because his habits carry him forward one familiar motion at a time through a universe that no longer surprises him, only exhausts him. At some point, Rick's habits begin to outlast even his explanations for them. Whatever logic once justified them has long since eroded, leaving only repetition behind. He no longer remembers why certain actions started. He only knows that stopping them feels wrong, like removing a support beam you forgot was holding anything up. So he keeps going. Rick's life, for all its scale, has narrowed into something surprisingly intimate. Not emotionally intimate, but structurally so. A small orbit of movements, preferences, and avoidances that define his days more than any grand experiment ever could. The universe may be infinite, but his personal world is tightly contained. This containment is deliberate, even if unconscious. He limits the number of variables he has to engage with at any given time. Same places, same tools, same rhythms. The fewer unknowns he allows into his daily life, the more energy he has to tolerate the unknown everywhere else. Habit becomes an efficiency system for existence itself. Rick does not waste curiosity on the ordinary anymore. He has already exhausted that impulse. Instead, he preserves the ordinary by keeping it unchanged. It becomes a background against which everything else can be measured. Without that background, even Rick would lose his bearings. He also has a habit of downplaying continuity whenever it is pointed out. If someone notices repetition, he deflects. If a pattern is named, he mocks it. Recognition threatens the illusion that he is entirely self-directed. Habit requires him to believe that he is choosing freely, even when he is repeating himself. Admitting reliance would imply limitation. Rick prefers to see himself as unbound, but his habits tell a quieter truth, that even someone who has transcended physical constraints still needs psychological scaffolding. That freedom without structure is not freedom at all, but collapse. He has learned this lesson the hard way. Rick's habits also serve as markers of survival. Each repeated action is evidence that he made it through another day without unraveling. They are not celebrations. They are confirmations. Proof that he remains intact enough to continue. He does not mark time with calendars or anniversaries. He marks it with repetition. If the same thing happens again, then time has passed and he has endured it. This is how Rick measures persistence. There is something almost ritualistic in the way he returns to familiar behaviors after disruption. No pause, no reflection, just immediate re-entry into routine, as if routine itself seals the fracture left by chaos, as if repetition can overwrite disruption simply by continuing. Rick trusts this process because it has never failed him. He does not believe in healing. He believes in functioning. His habits are optimized for that goal. They do not resolve pain. They allow him to operate around it. They reduce its interference to a manageable level, and in doing so, they shape the man he remains. Rick's weirdest everyday habits are not signs that he is stuck. They are signs that he has found a way to survive without illusion, without hope, without pretending that things will get better. Habit is what remains when belief is gone. And perhaps that is why these routines persist so stubbornly. They do not ask Rick to feel differently. They do not require growth or change. They only ask him to keep moving through the same motions, day after day, universe after universe. That consistency is the closest thing Rick has to peace. He will never call it that. He will never protect it openly. He will never admit it matters. But every day he returns to it. And in a man who claims that nothing matters at all, that return is louder than any confession. At this stage, Rick's habits have become so ingrained that they operate independently of circumstance. They persist across changes in setting, across disruptions in routine, across events that would unsettle anyone else. Even when everything else resets, his behaviors reassert themselves with quiet inevitability. This persistence gives his life a strange kind of continuity. Rick does not rely on memory to stay grounded. Memory is unreliable, distorted by loss and repetition. Habit, by contrast, does not ask to be remembered. It simply repeats. In a life where even identity can fracture, repetition becomes the most stable form of selfhood available to him. He is who he does, again and again. Rick's habits also insulate him from expectation. When behavior is predictable to himself, he does not have to negotiate with the future. He does not have to imagine alternatives. He does not have to hope. Habit allows him to exist without projection, anchored entirely in what has already proven survivable. This is not stagnation. It is containment. He avoids novelty in his personal space because novelty demands adaptation. He has adapted enough for several lifetimes. The familiar does not ask him to change shape. It accepts him exactly as he is, sharp edges and all. Rick never articulates this preference. He simply enforces it through repetition. Even his impatience follows a routine. The same irritations trigger the same reactions. This predictability reduces emotional labor. He does not have to decide how to feel. He already knows how he will respond. Habit removes ambiguity, and ambiguity, for Rick, is exhausting. He has also developed habits around disappearance, leaving without warning, avoiding goodbyes, slipping out of moments before they can solidify into something meaningful. These exits are not random. They follow patterns. Rick leaves at the same emotional threshold every time. This keeps attachment at bay. Rick's habits are also how he resists change that he did not initiate. When something shifts beyond his control, he doubles down on routine. He returns to what he can predict. The repetition stabilizes him long enough to regain a sense of dominance over his environment. In this way, habit becomes a defensive maneuver. What is striking is not that Rick has habits, but that he depends on them so completely while denying that dependence. He presents himself as a creature of pure intellect and impulse, yet his daily life is meticulously repetitive. This contradiction does not bother him. It protects him. Rick does not seek meaning in repetition. He seeks insulation. Habit shields him from the emotional consequences of awareness, from the weight of knowing too much for too long. He has learned that intelligence alone cannot sustain a person. Something else is required, something quieter, something less demanding. For Rick, that something is routine. His weirdest everyday habits are not mistakes. They are systems. Systems designed not to improve his life, but to keep it from collapsing under the weight of infinite understanding. He will never admit this out loud. He does not need to. His behavior says it for him. Every repeated action is a small declaration. This still works. This still holds. This is survivable. And as long as those declarations continue, Rick continues too. Not because he believes things will get better, not because he expects resolution, but because habit, stripped of hope and illusion, remains reliable. In a universe that refuses to make sense, Rick Sanchez has found one thing that does. He repeats himself. As time goes on, Rick's habits start to feel less like defenses and more like background scenery. They fade into the rhythm of the house, becoming part of the environment rather than something that draws attention. The repetition softens. What once looked deliberate now feels almost gentle. Rick moves through his routines without thinking about them, the way someone walks a familiar path without looking down. The motions are easy, efficient, comfortable, in their own strange way. They no longer carry tension. They simply exist. There is something almost peaceful about that. He does not rush when there is nothing demanding his attention. He drifts. He lingers in places that serve no clear purpose. A workbench he is not using. A chair he does not fully sit in. These pauses are not productive, but they are familiar, and familiarity is enough. Rick's habits begin to blur into a kind of low-level normalcy. The genius, the chaos, the danger all recede slightly in these moments. What remains is a man filling time the same way he always has, because it feels easier than inventing something new. He repeats actions not because they matter, but because they are already there. There is a quiet humor in this. The most unpredictable man in the universe living by patterns so stable they could be mapped. The same gestures, the same shortcuts, the same preferences. Infinity contained by habit. Rick would hate that observation if it were spoken, aloud. Yet the habits persist, not as chains, but as grooves worn smooth by use. They no longer restrict him. They guide him gently, reducing friction as he moves through his days. The universe may still be overwhelming, but his immediate world feels manageable. That manageability is what keeps him functioning. Rick does not seek comfort, but he tolerates it when it arrives disguised as routine. He accepts predictability not as a reward, but as a byproduct of repetition. Over time, this predictability becomes less about control and more about ease. Ease is something Rick rarely acknowledges, but often relies on. His everyday habits stop feeling strange when viewed this way. They are simply what happens when someone has seen everything and chooses, consciously or not, to keep a few things the same. Not because they are meaningful, but because they are reliable. Rick continues to tinker, to mutter, to drift through rooms with practiced familiarity. Nothing dramatic happens. Nothing needs to. The day moves forward without interruption, and that, in itself, is enough. In the end, Rick's weirdest everyday habits are not about avoiding the universe or mastering it. They are about living alongside it without friction, about finding a rhythm that does not demand attention or explanation. And maybe that is the lightest truth of all. For all his complexity, Rick Sanchez still lives one day at a time, one habit at a time, one familiar motion after another. And somehow, that ordinary repetition holds. At this point, Rick's habits no longer feel like something he leans on consciously. They have become part of the air he moves through, as natural and unquestioned as gravity. He does not think of them as choices. They are simply how his days unfold. That absence of thought is important. Thinking invites reflection, and reflection invites questions Rick has no interest in answering. Habit keeps him occupied just enough to avoid that spiral. It allows him to exist in a state that feels neutral, neither satisfied nor distressed, but functional. For Rick, functionality is enough. He does not wake up wondering who he is anymore. His habits answer that question before it can form. He is the person who does this next, and then this, and then this again. Identity becomes action without interpretation. There is something almost merciful about that simplicity. Rick's routines also soften the passage of time. Without milestones or reflection, days blur together. This blur reduces the sharpness of loss. If everything feels similar, then nothing stands out enough to hurt too badly. Habit smooths the edges of memory. He has learned, intentionally or not, that sameness dulls pain. Rick's everyday habits do not bring him joy, but they bring him equilibrium. They keep him from tipping too far in any direction. He does not spiral upward into hope or downward into despair. He remains suspended in a narrow band where existence is tolerable. That narrow band is where he lives now. He does not seek change within it. Change threatens to widen the emotional range, and Rick has spent too long learning how to survive by keeping that range small. Habit is the tool that maintains that balance. Even when chaos intrudes, his habits reassert themselves quickly. He returns to them like a reflex, restoring familiarity as soon as possible. The faster he returns, the less disruption lingers. Routine becomes repair. Rick never calls it healing, but it serves a similar function. His weirdest everyday habits, taken together, form a quiet system of self-regulation. They allow a mind burdened by infinite awareness to remain operational without collapsing under its own weight. They keep him grounded, not in meaning, but in motion. That distinction matters. Rick does not need life to be meaningful. He needs it to be bearable. His habits accomplish that with minimal effort and no emotional cost. They ask nothing from him except repetition, and repetition he can manage. In the end, Rick Sanchez does not survive because he is the smartest man in the universe. He survives because he has learned how to reduce existence to something repeatable, something familiar, something that does not ask him to feel more than he is willing to feel. His habits do not save him. They sustain him, and in a universe that never stops expanding, that quiet sustainability may be the closest thing Rick will ever allow himself to call peace. Eventually, Rick's habits become so seamless that they disappear into the background of his own awareness. He no longer distinguishes between what he chooses and what simply happens. Action flows into action, repetition into repetition, without interruption or commentary. This is exactly how he prefers it. Interruption invites thought. Thought invites feeling. Feeling invites questions. Habit removes the first step. Rick's days are no longer measured by outcomes, discoveries, or victories. They are measured by continuity. If the sequence holds, if the familiar motions repeat, then the day has passed successfully. Success for Rick has been redefined into something small enough to survive. He has learned that ambition exhausts faster than routine. There was a time when novelty drove him, when discovery felt urgent, when the unknown still promised something new. That time has long since collapsed under its own weight. Infinite variation eventually loops back into sameness. Rick understands this better than anyone, so he chooses sameness first. His habits form a buffer between himself and the endlessness of what exists. They reduce the universe to a manageable scale, a bench, a tool, a familiar sound. These things do not expand. They do not surprise him. They stay where he leaves them. Rick relies on that reliability more than he would ever admit. He also has a habit of dismissing moments that might have become meaningful if left alone. A pause stretches too long. A thought lingers too close to awareness. He disrupts it instinctively, filling the space with motion or noise. Habit protects him from reflection before reflection can take root. This is not fear in the traditional sense. It is self-preservation. Rick's habits are also deeply efficient. They minimize emotional overhead. There is no need to decide how to respond when the response is already rehearsed. No need to process when processing has been replaced by motion. This efficiency allows him to remain functional without engaging with anything he cannot control. He prefers systems that do not require belief. Belief asks for investment. Habit asks only for repetition. Over time, this way of living becomes self-reinforcing. The more Rick relies on habit, the less room there is for anything else. The narrower his emotional range becomes, the more necessary habit feels. It is a closed loop, stable and durable. Rick does not question the loop. He maintains it. Even when moments of awareness slip through, brief flashes of recognition, of fatigue, of something like longing, habit absorbs them quickly. The next motion arrives. The next routine begins. The awareness fades. This is how Rick survives knowing what he knows. His weirdest everyday habits are not contradictions to his intelligence. They are extensions of it. Logical responses to infinite exposure. Rational strategies for remaining operational in a universe that offers no inherent comfort. Rick Sanchez does not live dramatically. He lives repetitively. And repetition, in his world, is mercy. It keeps the edges dull. It keeps the noise low. It keeps him moving without asking where he is going. In the end, Rick's habits are not about control or avoidance or denial. They are about endurance, about finding a way to exist without demanding meaning from existence itself. He will never say this. He will never think it directly. But his behavior makes it clear. Rick Sanchez survives the universe not by conquering it, but by shrinking his daily life down to something familiar enough to tolerate. One habit, one motion, one ordinary moment after another. And somehow, against all odds, that is enough.